If walls could speak, there is one house in Britain the royal family might beg to keep quiet. Not Buckingham Palace with its balcony and flags, not even Windsor Castle with its postcard towers, but a pale cream mansion tucked among old oaks in Windsor Great Park, behind gates most people will never pass. A house with just 30 rooms, but centuries of secrets. A house where a shy princess played with her dolls, where a queen mother retreated with her whiskey and gossip, where a beloved matriarch died in bed at the age of 101, and where, years later, the same front door became the fortress of the most disgraced man in modern royal history, clinging on while the world hammered on the gates, asking, why is he still there? That house is Royal Lodge. On paper, it's just another Crown Estate property in Berkshire, a line on a spreadsheet with a valuation and a reference number. In reality, it has become a symbol, a battleground. To some, it's a story of privilege gone wrong, a 30-room mini-palace effectively rent-free, occupied by a man stripped of almost everything except this sprawling cocoon. To others, it's simply the latest chapter in a place that has always sat halfway between fairy tale and family drama. Tonight, I want you to picture yourself not as a YouTube viewer, but as a quiet observer standing just inside those big iron gates. The traffic noise from the main road has faded. It's mostly birdsong, the distant hum of the M25, and the crunch of gravel under tires when a car approaches the front door. If we stood here long enough, we'd see history as a kind of time-lapse, horses instead of Range Rovers, gas lamps turning into security floodlights, gardeners in tweed replaced by contractors in high-vis vests, and at the center of it all, this same house, watching royal lives rise and fall. Because Royal Lodge is not just where Prince Andrew lives. It is where a simple farmhouse became a royal playground, where a future queen learned to ride her pony, where a war-weary king tried to breathe, and where a son's scandal now gnaws at the foundations of a monarchy trying to convince a modern country that it still has a purpose. And the tragic punchline is this. Of all the grand homes tied to the House of Windsor, this quiet lodge in the park might be the one that tells the most uncomfortable truth about old money, entitlement, and what happens when a family famous for discretion suddenly finds its dirtiest laundry hanging in a garden that technically belongs to the public. But we'll get to the scandal. To understand why Royal Lodge has become such a lightning rod, we have to go back to a time when it wasn't royal at all. 3.5 centuries ago, if you'd walked across this patch of Windsor Great Park, you wouldn't have seen a cream-painted lodge at all. You'd have seen something far more ordinary. A modest farmhouse built around 1662, sitting among fields and rough pasture. There were cattle in the distance, smoke drifting from chimneys, and the sense that this was the back room of royal life, close to Windsor Castle, but not glamorous enough to bother putting on a postcard. The great park itself was the king's playground, a world of hunting and long views, of deer drifting between the trees. Over the years, the farmhouse passed through different hands and different purposes, slowly edging closer to the orbit of the royal household. In the 18th century, the park needed managing, measuring, mapping. Enter Thomas Sandby, a talented military topographer and artist who became deputy ranger of Windsor Great Park. By the mid-1700s, this little house in the park was his home. Imagine him at a desk, ink-stained fingers, sketching out how the land rose and fell, how the trees clustered, how roads should snake across the estate. Later, it was home to Joseph Frost, the park bailiff, one of those quiet, unglamorous posts that actually keeps the whole royal machine running. Not a palace, not a castle, just a working house in a working landscape, holding together the practical side of royal land. If you stood at the window in those days, you might occasionally see a royal carriage roll past, but the people inside probably barely glanced at the farmhouse. The first dramatic change came when a very different kind of monarch fell in love, not just with grandeur, but with charm. George IV, famous for waistcoats, mistresses, and a taste for over-the-top architecture, looked at this corner of the park and decided it could be more than a bailiff's house. In the early 19th century, a trend swept across aristocratic Britain for the cottage ornée, ornamental cottages, deliberately rustic, heavily designed rural retreats that looked like something out of a painting. Royal Lodge became one of these. You can imagine the transformation, the plain farmhouse remade as a romantic fantasy. Gables, verandas embroidered with woodwork, a building that tried to look simple and pastoral, but with all the expense and thoughtfulness of a royal commission. Not quite a palace, not quite a cottage, a theatrical backdrop for a king who liked his leisure to have a carefully curated style. George IV used this version of Royal Lodge as a hunting lodge and retreat. It wasn't where he ruled an empire, it was where he relaxed from it. Friends would come for weekends, riding in the park, dinners that stretched past midnight, music drifting out into the night through open sash windows. And outside the glitz there was always the staff, cooks, grooms, gardeners, maids. The house was already developing its double life, luxurious for the few, workplace for the many. Then a new king came along who wasn't quite as sentimental about architecture. When William IV succeeded to the throne in 1830, he looked at the cottage ornée and essentially said, "Start again." He ordered the house demolished and rebuilt in a more solid style, closer to what we'd recognize today as a proper country house. What rose on the same site was not enormous by royal standards, but it was dignified. A neat, stucco-fronted lodge with lawns, flanked by what would, over generations, become a small cluster of ancillary cottages and buildings. For the next century or so, Royal Lodge found a role that sounds almost disappointingly boring when you first hear it. It became home to senior members of the royal household, the behind-the-scenes figures who organize everything, from state visits to wardrobes. But if you think about it, you realize what that actually means. The corridors of this house were walked by private secretaries poring over dispatches, equerries juggling schedules, ladies-in-waiting juggling secrets. It became, in effect, the backstage green room for the monarchy, close enough to Windsor Castle that you could ride or drive there quickly, far enough away that you could exhale, loosen your collar, complain about your employer, the king, in private. And then came the 1920s and 30s, and with them, the family that would turn Royal Lodge into something more like a home and less like an office. Imagine the future, George VI, back then just Prince Albert, known to family as Bertie, a shy, stammering second son who never expected to be king. He'd married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, warm, clever, and socially confident where he was awkward. They needed somewhere to live that wasn't a palace, but still secure, still respectable. Royal Lodge, sitting quietly in the park, answers that need. By the 1930s, the house had been significantly reworked again, rebuilt around one remaining room of George IV's earlier cottage ornée, enlarged, modernized, and given the kind of comfortable country house feel that suited a young family rather than a grand court. Gardens spread out from the house, woodland glades, wide lawns, and flower beds shaped with the help of garden designers like Sir Eric Saville and Russell Page. It was formal in places, wild in others, the perfect backdrop for royal children to get muddy in. And soon enough, there were children. If you close your eyes for a moment, try to picture the most famous child ever to run around those lawns, a little girl born Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, known in the family as Lilibet, future Queen Elizabeth II. At Royal Lodge, she wasn't the image on a coin. She was just a child in a cardigan, leaning against a pony, shrieking with laughter when her little sister Margaret chased her through the garden. One of the most charming, and in hindsight, surreal features of the estate at that time was the tiny house on the grounds, Ibuthen Bach, the little cottage. It was a child-sized Welsh cottage, complete with running water and tiny furniture, given to Elizabeth as a present when she was 6. Imagine being 6 years old and having your own fully functioning mini-house, in the garden of a real one. She played house there with her sister and cousins, learning domestic rituals in a building that, even at knee height, was more substantial than many people's actual homes. That little cottage is still there today, quietly maintained, another layer of nostalgia in a place heavy with it. Royal Lodge, at that point, was not a scandalous address. It was where a close, rather middle-class-feeling royal family enjoyed something close to normality. Picnics on the grass, dogs everywhere, staff who had been there so long they were almost relatives. If Windsor Castle was the stage, Royal Lodge was the family sitting room. Then, in 1936, everything changed. The abdication crisis is usually told in grand constitutional terms. King Edward VIII choosing Wallace Simpson over the crown, cabinet meetings, radio broadcasts. But for Royal Lodge, it meant something quieter and more personal. Overnight, the quiet, stammering second son found himself transformed into King George VI. The Duke and Duchess of York became the King and Queen, and Royal Lodge, their cherished home, turned into a refuge from an unimaginable burden. You can picture those evenings in the late 1930s, the days red boxes dealt with at Windsor Castle, the formal duties fulfilled, and then the car down the hill into the park, through the gates, up the drive to Royal Lodge. The moment the door closes, shoulders drop a few inches. The new king pours a drink. The queen kicks off a pair of tight shoes. Little Elizabeth, now heir to the throne, is doing her homework at a table that looks suspiciously like the sort you'd find in any middle-class drawing room of the time. During the Second World War, the house's role as a refuge deepened. London was bombed. Buckingham Palace itself was hit. The king and queen famously remained in the capital as much as possible during the Blitz. But Windsor became a crucial fallback and base, especially for the princesses. Royal Lodge and the wider Windsor estate gave the children somewhere safer to sleep, to play, to grow up while the world burned. The image of the royal family as calm, domestic, and enduring, so important to morale, was in part staged in these very rooms and lawns. After the war, George VI's health deteriorated. He spent more and more time in quieter royal residences, Sandringham, Balmoral, Windsor. When he died in 1952, his widow, now Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, needed somewhere of her own. Somewhere that was neither Buckingham Palace nor an exile in Scotland. Royal Lodge, the house where they had found such happiness, became hers. From 1952 until 2002, half a century, the Queen Mother made Royal Lodge a kind of parallel court. Not the main one, with ambassadors and state opening of Parliament, but a softer, more intimate one. Her staff, her friends, her racehorse trainers, her favorite journalists, her ladies-in-waiting. They all passed through those doors. People still tell stories of lunches that slid lazily into early suppers, fortified by gin and Dubonnet, the Queen Mother's favorite tipple, served in the cozy drawing rooms, looking out onto gardens she adored. The gardens themselves were part of her personality. She loved color, and the borders reflected that, ribbons of flowers winding around the house. Camellias were a particular favorite. She grew them in each of her gardens, and when she died, camellias from Royal Lodge were placed on her coffin. The woodland garden and formal terraces, laid out in the 1930s with expert help, matured under her care into something both grand and deeply personal. To the outside world, the Queen Mother was the nation's grandmother, smiling, waving, impeccably hatted at the races. At Royal Lodge, she could let that slip a little. Here she could gossip about politicians, reminisce, spoil her dogs and granddaughters without worrying about cameras. The house became steeped in that aura, slightly old-fashioned, scented with flowers and cigarette smoke, packed with memories, photos, and keepsakes. And then in March 2002, at the age of 101, she died. Not in a palace, not in a hospital, but in her bedroom at Royal Lodge. Her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, was at her side. It was a calm, domestic ending for a woman whose life had spanned 2 world wars, abdication, and the transformation of Britain. The official announcement noted that she died peacefully in her sleep at the Royal Lodge, Windsor. That sentence alone cemented the house as something more than an address. It was the closing bracket of a hugely significant royal life. For a moment after her death, the house was almost untouchable. The public saw images of the flowers outside, heard stories of staff weeping in those rooms. The question then became, what happens to Royal Lodge now? Who gets to inhabit a house so closely associated with a much-loved figure? Here's where the story shifts from nostalgia to something more complicated. Royal Lodge is part of the Crown Estate, a vast portfolio of land and property technically owned by the Crown, not the monarch personally. Its profits go to the Treasury, which in turn funds the sovereign grant that pays for the official work of the royal family. It's a strange mix of private and public, tradition and modern finance. That matters, because the decision about what to do with the Queen Mother's old home wasn't just a family question. It was also, in a way, a public assets question. In 2003, a deal was struck. The second son of the Queen, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, would take on Royal Lodge under a 75-year lease. The terms are important because they are at the heart of today's scandal. Andrew agreed to pay a $1 million premium up front and commit to refurbishing the property at his own expense, to the tune of at least $5 million. In reality, he spent around $7.5 million on renovations, according to figures later quoted in an official National Audit Office report. In return, the Crown Estate agreed that because he'd exceeded the required investment, he wouldn't pay a conventional market rent. Instead, the lease specified only a token peppercorn rent, literally, in legal terms, the kind of purely symbolic amount that keeps a contract valid on paper. The lease was generous in other ways too. It runs until 2078. It allows the lease to pass on his death, not to the open market, but only to a very small circle, his widow, or his 2 daughters, or a trust for their benefit. If he gives up the lease early, the Crown Estate must, under the original terms, compensate him for some of the value of the refurbishments for a defined period, with figures in the hundreds of thousands of pounds being discussed in more recent coverage of his possible departure. On paper in 2003, to the people who signed off on it, the deal probably looked like a neat solution. A royal home with security sensitivities stays in royal hands. A senior working royal, then still flying around the world promoting British trade, gets a long-term base. The state avoids a large bill for refurbishing an aging property. The Crown Estate gets its $1 million premium and a promise of significant private investment in the building. But what looked tidy on a spreadsheet 20 years ago has aged very badly in the court of public opinion. In 2004, after renovations, Prince Andrew, his former wife Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York at the time, and their 2 daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, moved into Royal Lodge. Although Andrew and Sarah had divorced in the 1990s, their famously close relationship continued. They effectively set up a blended post-marital household, living together in this 30-room house with stables, cottages, tennis courts, and acres of grounds inside Windsor Great Park. For years, most people barely thought about it. Andrew was Air Miles Andy, flying as a trade envoy, sometimes mocked for his lifestyle and friends, but still, technically, doing a job. The image of Royal Lodge in those years is almost bland. A comfortable country seat where the Yorks came and went, where the princesses brought school friends, where staff maintained the gardens first planted for the Queen Mother. But behind the scenes, the finances were already getting complicated. To fund the extensive refurbishments of Royal Lodge, Andrew didn't just dip into savings. He sold his previous home, Sunninghill Park, a somewhat unloved modern country house that had been given to him as a wedding present and had acquired the nickname South York in the press because of its resemblance to an American suburban mansion. In 2007, after sitting on the market for years, Sunninghill was suddenly bought for $15 million, $3 million over the asking price, by an offshore company linked to Timur Kulibayev, a Kazakh billionaire and the son-in-law of Kazakhstan's then president. Andrew's office confirmed the sale, insisting it was a straightforward property deal, but the inflated price and opaque structures raised eyebrows. Later reporting suggested that much of that windfall went into refurbishing Royal Lodge, binding the house even more tightly to the web of Andrew's controversial finances. If Royal Lodge had remained just a slightly eyebrow-raising perk for a minor royal, it would probably never have exploded into full-blown scandal. What changed everything was not the house itself, but the man inside it. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, Andrew's choice of friends and associates was attracting increasingly negative attention. Relationships with wealthy businessmen from politically sensitive countries, questions about how exactly he funded his lifestyle, and his Air Miles reputation all chipped away at his image. Investigations later suggested that over 4 decades, he'd received many millions in support for his official work, while further private arrangements, trusts, and asset sales remained largely in the shadows. But nothing would compare to the damage done by 3 names: Jeffrey Epstein, Virginia Giuffre, and Pizza Express in Woking. Epstein, a wealthy American financier, was convicted in 2008 of sex offenses involving a minor. Andrew nevertheless continued to associate with him afterwards, staying at his properties and being photographed in his company. In 2015, court documents in the United States named Andrew as one of the people Giuffre alleged she had been trafficked to as a teenager, allegations he vehemently denied. For a while, the palace tried to ride out the storm with carefully worded statements. Then, in 2019, Andrew agreed to what would become one of the most disastrous television interviews in recent history. Sitting in Buckingham Palace with BBC journalist Emily Maitlis for a Newsnight special titled Prince Andrew and the Epstein Scandal, he attempted to clear his name. Instead, he made things far worse. He claimed he did not regret his friendship with Epstein because of the useful people he had met. He argued he could not have been with Giuffre on the night she claimed because he was at a Pizza Express in Woking at a children's birthday party, a detail so oddly specific it immediately lodged in the public imagination. He suggested that a medical condition meant he could not sweat at the time she described. The interview was watched in disbelief across Britain and around the world. The reaction was swift and brutal. Commentators called it a car crash. Within days, Andrew announced he would be stepping back from public duties for the foreseeable future. In 2020, prosecutors in the U.S. complained that he had not cooperated with their inquiries into Epstein. In 2021, Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit in New York alleging sexual abuse. Andrew denied the allegations, but in February 2022, he reached an out-of-court settlement, agreeing to make a substantial donation to Giuffre's charity. Various media estimates have suggested figures in the millions of pounds, though the exact amount remains confidential. Crucially, the settlement included no admission of liability, and Andrew has consistently maintained his innocence. But the reputational damage was enormous. As the legal case gathered steam in early 2022, Buckingham Palace took stronger action. The Queen stripped Andrew of his military affiliations and royal patronages, and it was announced that he would no longer use the style His Royal Highness in any official capacity. He retained his place in the line of succession, but as a public figure, he effectively disappeared. And all this time, he stayed at Royal Lodge. Think about that for a moment. While headlines around the world discussed allegations, settlements, and emails, Andrew's physical world narrowed down to this house in Windsor Great Park. He went from jet-setting prince to a man mostly seen riding around the estate on horseback or driving through the gates in a Range Rover. Protesters occasionally gathered outside other royal residences. Investigative journalists started asking not just, what did he do, but how is he paying for his life now? His trade envoy salary was gone. His official allowance from the sovereign's private wealth was reported to have been cut off. Yet Royal Lodge, with its estimated £600,000 a year upkeep, aging roof, and large staff, remained his base. That's the point where the story of this house and the story of this man fused into something the tabloids loved and the monarchy dreaded. Royal Lodge ceased to be the Queen Mother's old home. It became the 30-room mansion where a disgraced royal lives rent-free. Journalists dug into the lease. The phrase peppercorn rent appeared in article after article. The idea that while many people struggled with housing costs, a man accused of terrible things, who had now been cast out of official royal life, was living in a kind of mini palace without paying rent, outraged a lot of people. Yes, legally, he'd paid his premium and his refurbishment costs up front. Yes, the Crown Estate stressed that security considerations and long-term investment justified the deal. But emotionally, none of that washed. At the same time, another problem was quietly brewing. The house itself was not in great shape. Securing a 75-year lease on a big house is one thing. Maintaining it properly is another. Reports emerged of leaking roofs, crumbling stonework, peeling paint. Estimates appeared in the press suggesting that millions more would be needed to bring Royal Lodge up to scratch, sparking a rumbling dispute between Andrew and the Crown Estate about who exactly was on the hook for what. Some articles suggested that the tenant was responsible for most of the upkeep, but that questions existed over whether taxpayer-linked funds had, in practice, stepped in for some work. Parliamentary committees began asking for clarity about how the lease had been handled, whether repairs that should have been Andrew's responsibility had been covered by public money, and whether the whole arrangement represented good value for the public. And then there's the king. When Charles III came to the throne after Queen Elizabeth II's death in 2022, he inherited not just a crown, but a series of headaches. One of them was his younger brother living in this highly symbolic house. Modernizing the monarchy, trimming costs, and reducing the number of working royals was part of Charles's pitch to the public, whether explicitly stated or not. Having Andrew entrenched in a 30-room mansion that used to belong to their beloved grandmother while doing no official work and surrounded by scandal clashed badly with that image. Reports emerged of a game of homes within the royal family. The king, it was said, wanted Andrew to move out of Royal Lodge into more modest accommodation, perhaps Frogmore Cottage, the former home of Prince Harry and Meghan, itself recently vacant. Andrew resisted. From his perspective, he had a legally binding lease, had poured money into renovations, and saw Royal Lodge as his last secure foothold in a world where every other title, honor, and role had been taken away. From the king's point of view, the optics were awful. Why should his disgraced brother occupy a vast house on crown land for the rest of his life on a peppercorn rent, when the monarchy was trying to argue it understood modern Britain's sense of fairness? By 2025, this quiet tug-of-war had burst fully into public view. Articles described Andrew under siege at Royal Lodge, cut off financially, facing enormous maintenance bills, but apparently determined to hang on. Others reported that the king had stopped any private allowance to Andrew, forcing him to rely on limited pension income and whatever savings or asset sales he could organize. Campaigners demanded transparency about how he had paid his legal settlement to Joffrey, how the Sunninghill Park windfall and other deals linked back to his Windsor base, and what exactly had been covered via opaque trusts rather than the regulated Crown estate. Investigative reports into royal finances began using Royal Lodge as a case study, the perfect, concrete example of how old arrangements made behind closed doors can look grotesquely out of touch when dragged into modern daylight. A property valued somewhere around the £20 million mark, sitting in 98 acres of prime land, effectively locked down for the use of one man and his ex-wife, with the public bearing at least some of the indirect costs of security and estate management. And then in the autumn of 2025, the story tightened another notch. First came reports that Andrew would voluntarily stop using the title Duke of York after discussions with the king, a step designed to reduce distraction for the monarchy, but also a reminder of just how far he had fallen. Soon after, further revelations about his communications with Epstein years earlier, including an email suggesting continued solidarity after Andrew had supposedly cut ties, reignited public anger. Amid this renewed scrutiny, Buckingham Palace confirmed that, with the king's approval, all of Andrew's remaining royal titles, honors, and styles would be removed. He would henceforth be known in official contexts simply as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The picture that leaves at Royal Lodge is stark. The man living there is no longer a prince, no longer a duke, no longer a working royal. He is a private citizen in all but birth, facing ongoing questions about his past associations and finances, while occupying a house whose origins and ownership are deeply entwined with public institutions. Recently, reports have suggested that he has now been ordered to leave Royal Lodge altogether, with negotiations underway for him to relocate to a smaller property on the Sandringham estate, a private property owned by the king rather than the Crown estate. The exact compensation he will receive for giving up the lease early, and how much of the theoretically owed amount might be knocked off because of the lodge's current state of repair, has become a story in its own right. Some articles quote figures of around £500,000, tied to complex clauses in that original 2003 agreement. Others hint that the Crown estate is carefully assessing the condition of the building to make sure the taxpayer doesn't overpay for a house that may have been allowed to deteriorate. If those reports are accurate, the siege of Royal Lodge is finally ending. Andrew's time in the house that once sheltered his grandmother and his mother is running out. The gates may soon open, not for him to come home, but for surveyors, decorators, and planners to walk up the drive and start thinking about a very awkward question. What on earth do you do with Royal Lodge next? Because that's the thing. This is more than a personal drama. It's about what this building, this specific patch of land, actually is in 2025. Is it a private family home, full of memories of princesses on ponies and the Queen Mother's camellias? Is it a public asset that should be sweating every pound of value for the nation? Is it a security-sensitive bolt hole that can only ever be used by certain people? Or is it, as some critics would say, a relic of a system where people born into privilege make private deals for public property that the rest of us are never properly told about? Walk back with me through the front door just for a minute, as if we're doing one last tour before the family moves out. In the entrance hall, You can imagine family photographs on a side table, the Queen Mother in her youth, a young Elizabeth on her pony, Andrew in naval uniform, the York girls as teenagers. These walls have seen royal children learn to walk, and a centenarian queen breathe her last. They've heard servants being scolded for clattering trays, and lawyers quietly explaining the finer points of a 75-year lease. In one drawing room, perhaps there's still a hint of the Queen Mother's decor. Chintz sofas, perhaps, floral curtains, the kind of aristocratic clutter that makes a room feel lived in rather than staged. In another corner, more modern furniture from Andrew's era, bought in the 2000s with money that can be traced step by step back to opaque offshore deals and a controversial house sale. The same walls that heard wartime briefings now carry the echoes of awkward phone calls from per advisors, pleading with their client not to go on television and talk about Pizza Express. Step outside, onto the terrace designed in the 1930s. The great oaks and cedars of Windsor Great Park stretch away. Somewhere beyond the trees lies Windsor Castle, and beyond that the commuter belt, the M4 corridor, the everyday world of people juggling mortgages, rents, and bills. Within this estate boundary, one family's story has been playing out for centuries, largely shielded from those economic realities. And that might be the heart of the tragedy. Royal Lodge is tragic, not because it's cursed or haunted, or because terrible crimes took place there. They didn't, as far as we know. The alleged abuse that has so damaged Andrew's name is said to have occurred elsewhere. He denies those allegations and has not been convicted of any crime. The tragedy is more subtle, more structural. It's the story of how an institution built on deference and privacy tried to carry on doing deals the old way, long after ordinary people had stopped accepting "don't worry your head about it" as an answer. When the Crown Estate gave a long lease on Royal Lodge to a royal prince in 2003, they weren't thinking about what social media would say 20 years later. They weren't imagining a world where you could pull up satellite imagery of the property in seconds, where a Guardian Interactive could lay out every pound of public and private money that has flowed into and out of Andrew's accounts, or where a television interview could go viral for all the wrong reasons. They were thinking about continuity, about keeping a royal residence in the family, about ensuring someone was responsible for the upkeep. In their world, this looked like a sensible, respectful thing to do with the Queen Mother's beloved home. But continuity is not the same as accountability, and Royal Lodge has become the perfect case study of what happens when those two words clash. On one side, you have the weight of history, the memory of a shy princess playing in a miniature cottage, the ghost of a queen mother gliding down the staircase in pastels, the knowledge that a royal matriarch died peacefully in these rooms, after a century of public service. On the other, you have the reality of 2025. A man whose name is now followed, almost automatically, by the word disgraced. A settlement in a sexual abuse case that the public still knows little about in terms of who exactly funded it. A house whose legal papers have been pored over by MPs asking whether the public got a fair deal. And a monarchy that knows it cannot afford to be seen as a private club mismanaging public assets, not if it wants to survive another generation. So what happens next? There are a few possibilities. Royal Lodge could be refurbished again and given to another member of the family, perhaps one of the younger generation who still do regular public work. That would keep it in royal hands, but risks further criticism if the arrangement isn't transparent and clearly good value. It could be repurposed in a more public-facing way, a kind of museum of the Queen Mother, or a training center, or even in some wild alternate universe, opened in part as some sort of luxury venue that actually generates serious revenue for the Crown Estate. Security, of course, makes all of that complicated, or it could become something quieter again. Another backstage house, full of staff rather than princes, administration rather than drama. Whatever happens, the shadow of this period, the Andrew years, will hang over it. People will always say, that's the place where he holed up after the Newsnight interview, or that's the house everyone argued about when the king was trying to slim down the monarchy. The same way older generations remember it as the Queen Mother's home, or where Princess Elizabeth played in the garden, a younger generation may remember it primarily as that peppercorn rent mansion. And that's why Royal Lodge is, in a very real sense, the most scandal-soaked mansion in modern royal Britain, not because of something ghoulish or supernatural, but because it sits at the crossroads of nostalgia and accountability. If you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, you've watched this pattern unfold across your lifetime. The royal family you grew up with, all fairy tale weddings and horse races on the news, has slowly had layer after layer of myth peeled away. We've seen divorces, phone tapping, tell-all interviews, arguments about security, questions about cash in bags and opaque charities. Royal Lodge is simply the latest object lesson, a physical building that forces us to ask, who really owns this? Who really pays for it? And who in the end has to live with the consequences when the person inside falls from grace? The irony is almost painful. This house once nurtured a future queen who would, for 70 years, symbolize duty and restraint. It then cosseted a queen mother whose blend of charm and stoicism helped prop up the monarchy after the trauma of abdication. Now, in the public mind, it risks forever being linked to a man whose judgment, friendships, and choices did as much damage to that same institution as almost anyone in the modern era. If walls could speak, what would they say? They might remember the laughter of little girls in the little house down the lawn. They might remember the clink of ice in a glass at a queen mother's lunch party, the rustle of racing pages, the mutter of a king worrying about the next wartime broadcast. They'd remember, too, the click of a phone line going dead after a difficult call from Buckingham Palace, the low voice of a lawyer explaining what out-of-court settlement with no admission of liability actually means, the thud of a newspaper hitting the doormat, headlines screaming about pizza and sweat. They might, if we're honest, say something very simple. For 300 years, people in this house assumed that what happened here would stay here, that this was a safe place for secrets. And that, more than anything, turned out not to be true. So when you next see a small photo of Royal Lodge in an article or hear a throwaway line about a peppercorn rent mansion on the news, you'll know the fuller story. A farmhouse turned ornamental cottage, a royal backstage turned family home, a sanctuary turned symbol. A house that watched a monarchy built on deference stumble into a world where even a lease agreement can become front-page news. And somewhere in those quiet Windsor woods, a cream-colored lodge sits and waits. Maybe for a new tenant, maybe for scaffolding and surveyors. Definitely, though, for a public that now understands that even in the most carefully managed of royal estates, there is no such thing as a secret forever.